This week we're talking about React, a JavaScript library for building dynamic web pages. Now, the most important part of React is this idea of components. Components are modular, reusable chunks of code that we can drop into our HTML pages and that dynamically generate content based on their state and user events. In this lesson, we'll start to see how to define components and how we can include them in our HTML pages. React components are JavaScript objects that are based off the React.component prototype. And in the next few slides, we'll see two different ways to create React components. React components have four important parts: their properties, their state variables, and their callback functions or event handlers, and then their render function, which is used to generate the HTML. The virtual DOM manages each component and calls the render function whenever it's time to re-render that component. Here we see the classical way of creating a React component. We'll use the React.createClass function and pass it an object which contains the component's specification. So we see that we're creating a variable called hello component, which will be an object, and we'll use this React.createClass function to create that object. The argument to create class is itself an object, and one of the properties of that object is render, which is a function that will be called when it's time to draw or render this component. The render function needs to return the HTML to be rendered, to be drawn. And here we're using JSX. If you remember from last time, JSX is a technology that allows us to embed HTML right in our JavaScript. Once we've created the custom component in our JavaScript, then we can render it or drop it into our HTML using the React.DOM.render function. React.DOM.render takes two arguments. The first is the JSX or HTML that we want to render. Here we see that we're rendering a component called hello component, which is the one that we just created. You can think of it as creating new HTML tags. The second argument to React.DOM.render is the location of where we want to drop or place that component. And here we're using the DOM. We created a div called container. We're selecting that element by its ID, and we'll put the hello component at that location in the HTML. Another way of creating the React components is using the notation from a version of JavaScript known as ES6. We'll see ES6 a little bit later this week, but for now, suffice it to say that ES6 is a more recent version of JavaScript and allows us to create a class instead of a single object. This is the notation or the syntax that I'll use the rest of this week when creating React components. Rather than creating a variable called hello component, we'll create a class. This class will extend the React.component base class. Here we're defining the render function in our class, which looks the same as it did before, and will be invoked when we drop this component into the HTML. At the beginning of this lesson, I said there are four important parts of a React component. We've already seen the render function, and now here are the next two important parts. The first are the component's properties. Properties are the attributes and values that are set when the component is created. These should never be modified after initialization. The other important part is the state. The state is also attributes and values, but they represent the current state of the component based on what it does or represents. They can and should be modified during the component's lifecycle. And in the next few slides, we'll see some examples of each. It's worth pointing out that both the properties and the state can be used when rendering the component, but the important difference is that properties are set when the component is initialized, and state changes during the component's life. Let's talk about component properties. As I mentioned, component properties are the attributes and values that are assigned when the object is created, but should not be modified afterward. A component can access its properties through a property called props, which is an object containing all of the property values. We can set the properties of a component when we render the component using React.DOM.render. Here we see that we have a component called hello user, and we set its name property to the string Maria. So you can think of this as passing a variable or passing an argument to the component when it's created, but what we're doing is setting its name property. Now in the component, I have my hello user component, and in its render function, I can return some HTML, for instance, hello, and then I can access the property using this.props.name. This.props is the name of the property in the component. It is an object, and one of its properties is name, which was initialized when we rendered this component using React DOM.render. The next important part of the component is its state. The state is also a set of variables, but these can change during the component's lifecycle. The state is always initialized in the constructor, which is the function that's called when the component or object is created, and then it can access the state properties using this.state. In this example, we'll show the number of times that this page has been viewed. We create a component called timesViewed, and it will have a constructor. The constructor, as I mentioned, is the function that's called when this component or object is created. Now, the arguments to the constructor are the props, and we'll need to pass those to the superclass constructor using this notation, superProps. Then we'll initialize a variable called timesViewed to 0, and then we'll look in local storage. You may remember last week when we started talking about JavaScript in HTML that local storage was a way of storing values in between accesses to a web page. If local storage has a property called timesViewed, then we will set our local timesViewed variable to that value. If it doesn't have a timesViewed, then timesViewed will still be 0, so that when we increment it here, we're incrementing it either to 1 if it's the first time, or incrementing whatever its previous value was. Now here's the most important part of this example, setting the state of this component. We use this.state to access its state, and we set it to this object where we have the property numViews in the variable timesViewed. Last, to make sure this works, for the next time we open this page, we need to update local storage. Then we have the render function for timesViewed. The render function will return some text in bold, and it will return the numViews variable from the state. That is, we can access this component's state using this.state. State is an object, and one of its properties is numViews, and this will return the number of views, which we set here in the state. The last part of this lesson is to talk about what's known as the component lifecycle. Each component goes through 3 stages of its life, where it's being created, where it's being updated, and then where it's being destroyed, or as we say, unmounted. At each point of its lifecycle, React can invoke optionally different functions that you can write for controlling the component. The first part of the component's life is where it's being created, or as we say, mounted. We already saw the constructor, which is the function that's called when the component is created, and initializes the state potentially based on the properties. Then, before the component is added to the virtual DOM, the component willMount function is called. In this function, we can do any work that we want to do before we add it to the virtual DOM. Once it's added to the virtual DOM, then the render function is called, and then after that, component didMount is invoked, and at that point, the component can start accessing other parts of the virtual DOM. Next in the component's life is its cycle of being updated. We're going to see later how the component can react to user events, but for now, let's talk about the 4 callback functions that can be invoked during its lifecycle. First is component will receive props. This is invoked right before it receives new props, for instance, when its parent is being re-rendered. This allows us to compare the old props to the new props in case we need to do anything. The component doesn't have to be re-rendered. Before it's re-rendered, the shouldComponentUpdate function is called, and that returns a Boolean indicating whether this component should be re-rendered. If it's about to be re-rendered, then component will update is called, and then after it's re-rendered, component did update is called. Last, when it's the end of the component's life and it's about to be removed from the virtual DOM, the component will unmount function is invoked. In this lesson, we've seen how to create a component, how to specify its properties and its state, and how to use its render function to use JSX to render the HTML for that component. In the next lesson, we'll start looking at how the component can react to user events.